Welcome to Om on the Range, where we share the practice of meditation, the wisdom of Western Buddhism, and the refuge of our community. Whether you are new to meditation or a longtime practitioner, committed or curious, this offering is here to share solutions, stories, and support. Happiness and better health are available to everyone. It just takes practice. This is Om on the Range. Welcome to the 43rd edition of Om on the Range. I'm your host. My name is Whit, and I'm glad to be here. I am glad that you're here, and I'm very glad that our esteemed co-host is here. He is a good friend of mine and a key member of the Om on the Range team. Welcome back, Mr. Tim Behrens. Tim, how are you?
I'm doing well. Yeah, I'm excited to be here.
We'll see if you feel the same way for the next 35 minutes. So last week, the spiritual director and all-around good human, Victor Dougherty, gave a Dharma talk regarding the pace and effects of growth as it occurs on the path of Western Buddhism. And I think that it was a very well thought out and very timely presentation. And I think we were both moved so much that we decided that's what we would cover today. How do you think I did in summation of that talk, at least as to what it's about?
Some of the ideas and things that you put together, I think you did a wonderful job. There's so many good talking points, so many things that came from that. And like you said, it was very timely. I feel like the last couple of times I've been at the Temple Buddhist Center, I've come away with just that feeling like that's what I needed to hear. And I think that is one of the beauties of Sangha is sometimes it feels very magical that we get to hear what's happening in community, what's happening in the Dharma talks. We get to hear that reflected in our lives. It feels magical sometimes.
Yeah, you know what? And I think that also plays into the subject matter we're going to touch upon, but that, like you said, that serendipity of when you're sitting there and the talk seems to morph or meet you at least halfway with the things that you're dealing with or feeling, and sometimes you bring those things with you, and sometimes you don't know that that's where the connection's going to be. It's almost like a next level to being a member of the Sangha or being a part of this, is that you start to realize it's not just luck or happenstance that today's talk struck so firmly to where it needed to land. But I do think it takes some time, just like some of the other things we're about to talk about, where there's no shortcuts to them and there's no way of knowing when that magic will occur. But even magic is probably obviously the wrong word. There's not a whole lot of recognizable magic in Western Buddhism, other than if you stick with your practice, you start to realize that there are some things going on here that are bigger than your ego and maybe the things you were taught.
Yeah, and you sent me some really wonderful summaries and questions that came from that talk, and I noticed in myself a little bit of an anxiousness because they were such good questions and wanting to have those answers. And then reflecting on some of these, what I'm realizing is sometimes the questions themselves are enough. It is that idea of these are things that I'm reflecting on, these are things I'm working with, experiencing, and just the act of asking them is the journey, and then
Yeah.
asking them again and seeing how things change over time. That idea that it is a journey, these things that we learn and move through.
Yeah, it's so interesting also that the issues or problems or challenges, it's not about solving them, but it is about, like you just said, asking the questions and recognizing them and giving them some space, not
Hmm.
trying to fix them, not trying to change them, not trying to change yourself necessarily, but just it's so odd how effective that is to just be with them and to just ask. And also, it helps remove some of the fear and some of the angst and anxiety. And it becomes much more of an active learning process. And it's so rewarding in that. In fact, it makes me wonder how much more would I have enjoyed the formal education process if I would have brought that type of attitude towards it, as opposed to being a 13-year-old Whit who just wanted to get out of class.
Right.
I blame so much on 13-year-old Whit. Go ahead.
He would be proud of you.
Yeah, I'm sure that that's probably not as true as I'd hoped, but yeah, it's something. So let's talk a little bit about the talk. One of the first points that was brought up was just how spiritual awakening tends to unfold gradually rather than a sudden transformation. And before I let you wade into that, one of the things that came up for me was it's true. It certainly unfolds gradually, and it's certainly an interesting, that's really in one question. That's kind of the gist of why I thought it was important that we sat down and had this talk. But also, there are sudden aha moments, sudden parts of the transformation that feels it's life changing, but you never know for sure how that is or how that's going to feel or when they're going to land. So I think it's a real juxtaposition how, hey, it's gradual, but it's also sudden. And
Mhm.
you really can't understand that unless you made the journey or are making the journey. Is that true for you as well?
I think so. Yeah, when I look back over my own life and my spiritual journey, I feel like there have been lots of different points of expansion and contraction, or one might say peaks and valleys and plateaus, times where things were happening very fast and I was gaining lots of insights and having lots of internal transformations and seeing the world reflect that. And then there were times where none of it made any sense. And even sometimes the things that did make sense at one point would fall away, where I would have to recalibrate or I would have to really re-examine the things that I believed or the things that were giving me purpose and connection. And in a way, I think I found that in those plateaus, those times that felt slower, where I felt that absence of knowing and connection, that there would come a point where I would realize that that served a purpose as well. That life is really this expansion or, this expanding idea of contrast. Like I can't really fully know the experience of being happy if I haven't had that experience of being discontent or of having resilience if I haven't had that experience of impatience or stumbling, that it really is through that ebb and flow that we learn and we grow. And ideally, in the practice, we also find presence where if we're constantly striving for something, or constantly trying to reach some peak state or some emotion or feeling, we're also setting ourselves up for the loss of that because
Right.
everything is impermanent. So how do I learn to be present with what is and not build so many narratives around it that I'm creating my own suffering? And I think that was really in the talk, that idea that when we deal with the things that are present and we don't build narratives around it, that they do pass. And the practice is, how can I be with what is?
Do you suppose spiritual awakening actually unfolds in a pretty consistent manner? And it takes a certain amount of practice to realize that as a practitioner, as someone on the path?
Just after what I just said, I have these contrasting views that are coming up in the sense that I think things do unfold over time, and sometimes they're so subtle that we realize that something that was once confusing to us suddenly makes sense. Like even the example of, I remember reading Eckhart Tolle's The Power of Now many years ago, and when I read it, it was way over my head. I
Yeah.
knew there was something there, but I didn't really fully understand it. And then a number of years later, I had what I would call an awakening experience, which happened quite suddenly. It was a very dramatic shift in my life. And at some point after that, I read that book and revisited that, and suddenly the things that didn't make sense were there. They were clear. They were clicking. And yeah, so in that way, it's like it is a gradual unfolding, and sometimes it's quite a dramatic shift. And then the integration becomes the unfolding after that, I guess.
Yeah, I also wonder as we have these moments of clarity and growth. I know this happens for me a lot, and I'd like to think that it's getting less so, but there's also, it only takes a few moments before ego jumps in, and says, yeah, we're making great progress. And,
Hmm.
let's put together let's write a book about it, or let's tell everybody about it, or let's change how we do things, or let's take a day off, or you know what I mean? You never know where your ego might, but all of a sudden it starts to become a, you start judging it. How can we do it better? And how can we do it quicker and all that? And pretty quickly, then you kind of feel like, you've killed your own momentum or you've killed your own magic. Again, we're going to get thrown out of Western Buddhism if we keep using magic as a, as a describer. But, but yeah, I just think it's interesting that you feel like you're going places and then like I said, your ego immediately jumps in and wants to be a part of it. And it tends to shoot the wheels
Right.
off.
And I do think the ego is constantly striving for happiness and success, however that's defined for us, trying to heal old wounds and move into greater states of being and seek enlightenment and awakening and all of these things. Through that talk and some of the reflections that you shared, I was reminded of a book. It's called Emergence by Derek Rydell. And it's an interesting book because it kind of addresses some of the pitfalls of the self-help phenomenon, which I think is an ego-driven thing in some ways, in the sense that we're constantly striving to be better. But there's that idea that in striving to be better, that we have somehow adopted the idea that there's something wrong with where we're at now, you
Right.
know, that there's something inherently broken within us. And the book has the metaphor of, he talks a lot about the acorn holding the blueprint for the mighty oak, and that idea that within that seed is the potential for something that can weather all of the storms, that can grow and spread its branches, and that there is something inherently perfect about us too. And when we're not striving and we're with what is, then we can start losing the labels and just say, this is the experience of life unfolding. It's the labels that create the suffering in some ways, because if we are looking at it from a perspective of what is, and that how it lives within us and how we feel it and how we move through it, it's like this uniquely human thing that we get to go through. Even in the darker moments, there's something beautiful about it from some level or some perspective.
Thank you for sharing that, by the way. But just as you were talking, it also just made me realize, well, two things. One, I realized a long time ago with self-help books and self-help type, generally, they're only going to work if you write them for yourself. Salvation is an inside job, and other people can certainly provide some clues, some breadcrumbs along the way. I love what you said about that book and the idea of what the acorn holds and what that clue is for us right there is that, hey, it's inside and all your potential is there and all the solutions are there. And by the way, just how mighty of an oak tree could you be if you quit judging the whole process and instead just were that? And I found a lot of comfort and a lot of, well, frankly, I found a lot of happiness in just that. I finally feel like I'm starting to really see not the negative energy that judging brings to your life, but the possibility of living with a lot less judging. I'm catching myself there when it comes up. And so I am now going to segue into this whole idea of a spiritual bone setting, which is
Yeah.
part of the talk. But what I thought was really interesting was this idea that Victor shared about how martial artists, how if you dislocate a part of your body, how if you reset it quickly, the damage is minimalized. And if you do not set it quickly, then the damage becomes more long term and more difficult to heal from. The point being that for practitioners such as ourselves, that when things come up, the best way to deal with them is to deal with them quickly. In other words, Tim said something that offended Whit. If Whit's a good practitioner and wants to try to follow this and wants to have less suffering in his life, first of all, he tries not to take it personally, but also he stops to notice, how's it feel? Where does it hurt? What caused it? And not judge Whit or Tim, but instead just notice the feeling, sit with it, but try to do that quickly. Try to experience anger, for example, and then let it go. And so I just thought it was so interesting about how the analogy of how that will really shorten my healing and shorten the amount of damage that I let a wound, inflict upon me. Is that where you were with it too, or was I the only one? And maybe I
Yeah,
slipped
no,
in
I
there.
I relate a lot of what you said, a lot of what was said that day, to some of the authentic relating practices, which is just to say that we are amazing storytellers. By nature, that's what we do. We have experiences and then we create narratives around them. And especially when it comes to conflict and communication, how often we let something affect us, but then we don't address it and it becomes a narrative all of its own. And then suddenly the narrative is taking on a life and moving in a different direction, irregardless, if that's the right word, of the truth. And if we haven't checked our assumptions or actually spoken with the person that we're telling this narrative about, it can grow into some giant thing. And I feel that's true for a lot of conflict and suffering in general, is that there's the point of suffering, and then there's all of the stories we'll tell about it that perpetuates it through our days, right? So
Right.
if we can learn how to be with something as it happens, one, we're learning our own resilience. We're learning that we can navigate these things much better than we expect. And two, we're more with that present moment of experience of how is this living in my body? What am I feeling? What could I say that would be supportive of me right now? All of those things. And I know that we are also adaptive in that we will build strategies and patterns to help us from reliving a moment of pain over and over again. We do this when we're children and we perpetuate that through life. A lot of the patterns that we find ourselves in, we developed very long time ago, and we're being reactive to something that may not even be present. So yeah, so the challenge is how do we allow ourselves to really be there for what is unfolding and really speak our truth and
Well, you know what though? The idea of being present is something you learn pretty quickly as a practitioner, both as a Western Buddhist and also as a person who meditates. You're trying to be present, you're trying to be present. And as you continue to become, I don't know, more aware, become more comfortable with what the practice is, you start to realize just how valuable and important that is. Because if you can stay present, you can deal with stuff and you can stay in the moment and not get caught up in the suffering. People in the present don't suffer near as much as people that are worried about the future or upset about the past. And as you become, like I said, a more veteran practitioner, you start to understand that it's not a point in time. It's not even just a strategy or a theory you're trying to maintain. It's a weapon. It's a weapon in that it's your weapon against suffering. It's your weapon against being a miserable human being.
yeah, I like the idea of equating it even to like the practice of meditation too, where we have thoughts coming up all the time and we find a focal point like the breath and we notice the thoughts. We don't try and shun them or beat ourselves up for having them, but we also try not to attach to the narratives. It's like, okay, there's the thought, I'll touch it gently, return to the breath. However many times I return to the breath is perfectly fine and valid. And in that same sense, I feel like experiences like that too. It's like I like the idea of not identifying with something, of someone saying, instead of saying, I'm really depressed right now, might be able to say something more like, I'm noticing depressive feelings are present.
Right.
And in that way, I'm not identifying with them. I'm just saying that this is an experience that I'm having. And if I don't identify with them, I can let go of them more easily as well. Um, or maybe just learn to work with them in a different way. Maybe it's not even letting go of them, it's just being with them. So whenever we feel something, there's a message behind it. There's something that's trying to draw our attention to something. And if we can accept the messenger, then that feeling will often go away. And even coming back to meditation, I remember one of the very first group meditations I was ever in. I wanted to look like I belonged, and I wanted to have that perfect posture and not move and seem like I was still in Zen and all of those things. And just a few moments into it, I got the most terrible itch in my knee and just did everything I could to not scratch it. And I noticed the more that I tried to resist and turn my attention away, the stronger it became. And at some point in time, for whatever reason, I just decided to give it my attention and presence, and it went away. Almost like whatever that message was, once I received it, the physical sensation behind it went away. There's something metaphorical in there. I don't know exactly what it is.
Well, you know what? It's funny. The itch syndrome is something that I dealt with for about 15 years, and it was just so constant. It was usually somewhere on my face. It was very intense, and I just learned to just sit there and be with it. That approach is uncomfortable, but then you even get comfortable with the uncomfortable, and that's where there's some real growth. And it'll still happen now, but it's more of it's almost like a gag now, as opposed to a real existential challenge to my practice. I have other ones of those, but that's not one of them. I think the other thing I wanted to go back to was we were talking about suffering and the idea of dealing with it in the present, which made me think about some of the things that happened in our past that we still carry around. This practice, meditation and Western Buddhism both give you that opportunity to sit with those past sufferings. What I found recently is as I go back to them or as something new comes up, I can feel the suffering. I can identify that. But it's interesting to me because when I try to drill down as to what actually happened and what's causing it, a lot of times there's not much there. You know, it's the suffering has grown, but the event hasn't necessarily. It's like, oh, I'm suffering about this event that happened when I was 17. And when I look back, it was like, oh, well, that was just 17-year-old Whit who, yeah, it doesn't look like it was a great thing that happened to him then, but that's just what happened. You know what I mean? You start to accept it. It's the suffering, but you got to have the courage to grab the whole thing and get it out. You're going to kind of wade through the pain.
Yeah. When we think about that idea of the practice and the journey being an unfolding, something that happens over time, I know in parts work, they would say that we have these versions of ourselves that got stuck in time when traumatic things happened or things that we didn't know how to move through happened, and that those parts still live within us. And often, though, like as a defense mechanism, we build up walls around those parts to keep from being hurt again. And those parts don't really recognize that we've grown up, that we have evolved, we've learned new things, we've learned new ways of moving through them. And I've had that experience. I'm going to be metaphorical again without giving a lot of examples, but of like having these internal defenses that I had, I built up all of these walls around something that felt so vulnerable and scary and, maybe a source of shame or guilt. And then one day, maybe through an authentic relating practice, I have an interaction with someone where I reveal that, I speak my truth, or I tell this story of this thing. And as I do, I find out that the charge of it, the impact of it is no longer there. Like I was spending more energy on the walls to find that there was really nothing behind them anymore. And maybe that's a process of being present too, like making decisions on how I'm feeling, what my truth is in the moment allows me to maybe let some of those things go or realize that they're not really true anymore. We're just acting as if they are.
Right. It also kind of leads me to that whole idea of, hey, we're going to surrender. As opposed to building castles to defend, we're going to surrender everything. We're going to tear those walls down. We're going to accept whatever it is that we thought was so important that we keep locked up, but we're also going to accept whatever happens to us, whatever comes up. And we don't have to worry about anybody else in the world or any other event. All we have to do is worry about what's coming up for us. And the reason that's true is if things are good on the inside, they'll be good on the outside. If I can accept all the crap that I'm causing internally, then I'll be fine with everybody else's stuff. And it's just so interesting how that works. It goes back to, if I can love myself, I'll be able to love anybody. And that's true. I find that 100% accurate. But it's all about what goes on inside. And so it's a real clue. And that's why I think meditation is such an invaluable practice and why it provides so many benefits, because we're really just sitting there noticing what is really inside of us. And as that comes up, we're comfortable with it and we can be a better version of ourselves.
So there are so many things in there. One is that I feel like the idea of surrender could be a whole conversation in and of itself. That word has come up for me so many times in my journey in recent years, and really curious about how that relates to the Buddhist practice and ideas. But also, one of the questions or reflection points you sent me was that idea of how does a spiritual practice naturally lead people toward compassion and service to others? And I think you just touched on that, but I really love that reflection point. Like, what happens as we start to learn to be present with things and we stop striving to be some ideal or being ego driven? And I think it is that idea that as we're realizing this unfolding, as we're learning to be present, as we're letting go of these old patterns, that process, it's challenging. It does have its peaks and valleys. And I think as we recognize that, we also start to see it as a point of connection. Even in authentic relating events, it's often the things that we share that feel most vulnerable that become the greatest point of connection, because suddenly we're realizing maybe we're not broken in the way we thought we were. Maybe we're just having a human experience. And then we haven't been taught how to talk about it. And when we do talk about it, we find that we want everyone to have that experience, to have that knowing, and it's not from a place of ego, it's from a place of love and recognition.
Yeah, we've touched on some real mile markers. The beautiful thing about this sort of practice, about Western Buddhism and meditation, are that all of this stuff is accessible and it seems to be consistent for everyone who practices. We kind of discover what we all share. And it's this love that we have for each other and this connection and this love we have for ourselves. And I guess that's one and the same. But, and I think that leads us to what our experience has been. Long-term practitioners who also make up a Sangha. We're going to use TBC Sangha because that's the one we belong to. We've talked before about that spirit of community has never been as clear, but for me, it's never been as clear as it is with that group of people. It's just another benefit of having a practice, but being around people that there's no rules. There's no, in order to be part of this, you have to do this and this and this. There's none of that. It's just a choice. Show up, be as sincere and as open and as authentic as you can be. And that's the Tim that we need. That's the people that we need in this Sangha. That's what makes us strong. And there's no ego. There's no we're better than them. Everyone is welcome. No one is right. There's no righteousness. There's no judging. I don't really know where I'm going with this. Come in and rescue me. Let's go to the bullpen on this one.
Well, there's something that Victor said that I really loved, which is that idea that when we are in Sangha, when you're with people who have been in the practice for years, that when you come to them with a struggle, you're probably not going to find someone trying to rally the troops to find out who the enemy is or to validate your experiences in such a way that you are making sides or you're making struggle where, there might not need to be. It's really more about coming back to even where we started, that idea that sometimes they'll just ask questions. It's like, I think the best teachers are the ones that approach it from the point that they may not have the answer for another person. They might have the questions that will help that other person find the answer for themselves. But when we're in community and Sangha together, it really is just this idea of helping each other see our blind spots, because we all have them. And when people are asking the right questions and doing it in a supportive, loving, caring kind of way, it becomes this collective journey. Like, we are evolving as a community. It's not just individuals who are on this unfolding path. It is the collective that is learning and growing and sharing and together.
So we're coming to the end of our time. It's flown by just like it always does when you're on, and that's a compliment. Before I let you wrap this up, I guess my question for you is, we've talked on how the talk landed as a couple of people who have practiced for a while, and I'm just going to leave the definition of what we've done right there. But if somebody's new to Western Buddhism or meditation, I always like to ask or recommend they focus on awareness, acceptance, patience. And I still find that to be true. I think that's the simplest way to maybe define or describe or give some guidance on what practice is. Would you agree with that? Would you add anything to that before we wrap this up?
Yeah, it's interesting. What's coming up for me is actually in relation to music. A lot of the things that I do, I relate to my own journey with that. But how often when we come into something new, we see the people who are very experienced in it. It's around us, like what the idea of success is. Say someone learning to play guitar, and I've heard this so many times. It's like, oh, it's too late in life, or I just can't imagine ever being that good at something. And ultimately, my feeling is like we all have a love of music. It's all intrinsically in us. It becomes a point of connection. And if somebody wants to learn to play an instrument, to find joy where they're at, find the things that make them happy. Don't worry about how good they're going to get. The practice will make them better. That's a natural response to putting time in. But if you're present with the experience of making those notes and singing those songs in whatever way you do, uniquely you, that's the journey. That's the unfolding. And it's just to enjoy it.
I think the catchphrase we got out of that is the practice will make them better. So thank you for that, by the way.
Yeah.
I want to go ahead and just thank you for being on as co-host. You do a great job as always. You're a great friend, and your wisdom is only surpassed by your support and your friendship. So thank you, Tim.
Thank you.
I also want to thank all of our listeners, and remember that we can be found on Spotify, YouTube, and the TBC website. Feel free to follow the show and to leave comments on any of those platforms. You can email the show at ohmOnTheRangePodcast@gmail.com. This is your host, Whit, signing off and wishing you happy trails. Thanks to our Ohm on the Range production team for making this program possible, and to Mr. Brad Athey for composing and performing the original music. And to you, our listeners, thank you for being a part of this journey as we explore meditation, Western Buddhism, and the path towards a happier, healthier life. Remember, less suffering and more joy are available to everyone. It just takes practice. Until next time, stay grounded, stay kind, and keep finding peace in the simple, practical things. For all of us here at Ohm on the Range, happy trails.